2,500 years ago, a young prince named Siddhartha had everything you could ever want. Unlimited wealth, beautiful palaces, the finest food, and servants attending to his every need. Yet every night, he lay awake, tormented by a question that wouldn't leave him alone. Why does everyone suffer? He had watched his servants worry about their families. He saw his advisors stress over kingdom affairs. He noticed that even the wealthiest nobles were never truly satisfied, always wanting more, always afraid of losing what they had. Most disturbing of all, despite having every luxury imaginable, he felt that same restless suffering inside himself. Welcome to Echoes of Dharma. What this prince discovered during his search for answers became the most practical guide to inner peace ever found. Not mystical theories or complicated philosophies, but simple truths that immediately transform how you experience stress, anxiety, and life's daily challenges. Think about your own life right now. How much of your suffering comes from your mind fighting against reality? How often do you lose sleep worrying about things you cannot control? How many times has your peace been shattered by someone else's words or actions? Here's what Prince Siddhartha realized that changed everything. Your external circumstances don't create your suffering. Your mind's resistance to those circumstances does, and that resistance is completely optional. Over the next hour, I'll share the most transformative stories from Buddhist masters who proved this truth in the most challenging situations imaginable. Stories of people who found unshakable peace in the middle of war, loss, betrayal, and chaos. More importantly, I'll show you exactly how they did it, so you can experience that same freedom. The journey begins with one man's decision to sit under a tree and not move until he solved the mystery of human suffering. What he discovered there will completely change how you handle every difficulty in your life. One night when Prince Siddhartha was 29 years old, he made a decision that would change the world forever. He looked around his golden palace, at his sleeping wife and newborn son, at all the wealth and power that was his birthright, and he walked away from it all. This wasn't a sudden impulse. For years, he had been haunted by what he called the four sights. During rare trips outside the palace walls, he had encountered an old man bent with age, a sick person writhing in pain, a corpse being carried to burial, and finally, a wandering monk who seemed strangely peaceful despite having nothing. These sights shattered his sheltered worldview. He realized that no amount of wealth or power could protect anyone from aging, sickness, and death. Yet somehow, that poor monk radiated a contentment that all the riches in his palace couldn't buy. So Siddhartha left everything behind and walked into the forest, determined to find the answer to human suffering. He became a wandering seeker, studying with the greatest spiritual teachers of his time. For 6 long years, he tried everything imaginable. He learned complex meditation techniques that took months to master. He studied ancient philosophies until his mind could barely hold all the concepts. When intellectual approaches failed, he tried extreme physical practices. He fasted until his ribs showed through his skin and he could barely stand. He stayed awake for days until exhaustion nearly killed him. He endured pain that would break most people, thinking that somehow suffering would lead him to the end of suffering. But here's what's so important for your own journey: nothing worked. After 6 years of trying every method available, Siddhartha was more confused and desperate than when he started. His body was wasted, his mind was exhausted, and he was no closer to understanding why people suffer. Think about this in your own life. How many times have you tried to solve your stress and anxiety by changing external circumstances? Maybe you thought a new job would make you happy, or a relationship, or moving to a different city. How often did those changes provide lasting peace? Siddhartha was learning the same lesson. External changes, even extreme ones, don't touch the source of suffering, because suffering isn't created by external circumstances. Finally, weak from hunger and ready to give up, he sat down beneath a large bodhi tree beside a river. Local people had been watching this strange ascetic torture himself for years, and a kind village woman named Sujata brought him a bowl of rice milk. As Siddhartha drank it, he realized something profound. Neither luxury nor extreme deprivation had brought him answers. In that moment, he made a vow that would transform human understanding forever. I will not move from this spot until I understand the truth about suffering, even if my body dies here. What happened during the next 49 days wasn't dramatic visions or mystical experiences. It was something much more practical and revolutionary. Siddhartha began to observe his own mind with perfect clarity. He noticed that every time his mind wanted something to be different than it was, he suffered. When mosquitoes bit him and he wished they would stop, he suffered. When his back ached from sitting and he wanted comfort, he suffered. When memories of his family arose and he wished he was with them, he suffered. But then came the breakthrough that became the foundation of all Buddhist teaching. He realized that the mosquitoes, the back pain, and the memories weren't creating his suffering. His mind's resistance to these experiences was creating the suffering. The mosquito bite was just a sensation. The back pain was just information from his body. The memories were just thoughts arising and passing away. None of these things were inherently painful. The pain came from his mind's insistence that these experiences shouldn't be happening. Picture this in your own life. When you're stuck in traffic, what actually creates your stress? Is it the cars moving slowly, or is it your mind screaming that this shouldn't be happening, that you should be somewhere else, that this delay is ruining your day? The traffic is neutral. It's just cars occupying space. Your suffering comes entirely from your mental resistance to the reality of slow-moving vehicles. Siddhartha saw this pattern everywhere. When people criticized him, the words themselves were just sounds. The pain came from his mind's belief that they shouldn't say those things. When he felt hungry, the hunger was just a body sensation. The suffering came from his mind's demand that the hunger should go away immediately. This insight led to an even more profound realization. If suffering comes from mental resistance to what is already happening, then peace comes from accepting what is already happening. Not passive resignation where you give up trying to improve things, but a conscious choice to stop fighting against reality. In the moment he truly understood this, something extraordinary occurred. Siddhartha experienced complete peace for the first time in his life. Not because his circumstances had changed, he was still sitting on hard ground with an aching back, but because his relationship to his circumstances had transformed completely. He had become the Buddha, which simply means the one who woke up. He woke up from the dream that external circumstances control inner peace. Here's what modern neuroscience tells us about what happened to the Buddha's brain during those 49 days. Our brains are wired with what scientists call a negativity bias. We are programmed to resist and fight against unpleasant experiences because this helped our ancestors survive physical dangers. But in modern life, this same mental program creates chronic stress and anxiety. Your brain treats a critical email the same way it would treat a charging tiger, with fight-or-flight responses that flood your system with stress hormones. The Buddha discovered that we can rewire this automatic response. We can train our minds to accept unpleasant experiences without resistance, which immediately eliminates the stress response. This isn't just ancient wisdom, it's practical brain training that measurably reduces anxiety and improves mental health. But accepting reality doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on improving your life. Here's the paradox the Buddha understood. When you stop wasting energy fighting against what has already happened, you have much more energy available to create positive change. When you're not caught up in mental resistance, you think more clearly, make better decisions, and respond to challenges with wisdom instead of reacting with emotion. This is why people who practice Buddhist principles often seem so calm and effective. They're not burning energy on internal battles. The Buddha spent the rest of his life teaching this simple but revolutionary insight. Your peace doesn't depend on what happens to you, but on how your mind relates to what happens to you. And that relationship can be completely transformed through understanding and practice. But his journey was far from over, because as soon as word spread that this former prince had achieved perfect peace, people came to challenge him. Some wanted to learn from him, others wanted to test him, and some wanted to destroy what he had found. What happened next would prove whether this inner peace could survive the real world, starting with the most powerful attack on enlightenment ever recorded. The moment Siddhartha achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, his inner peace faced its greatest test. According to Buddhist tradition, a powerful force called Mara, representing all the mental patterns that keep us trapped in suffering, appeared to challenge the newly awakened Buddha. But this wasn't some external demon or mystical battle. Mara represents something far more real and dangerous, the voice in your own mind that tries to destroy your peace through doubt, desire, fear, and temptation. Every person who has ever tried to find inner calm knows this voice intimately. Mara's first attack was through desire. Beautiful visions appeared before the Buddha, pleasures beyond imagination, promises of unlimited sensual gratification, offers of every comfort and luxury he had abandoned when he left the palace. The temptation was to abandon this difficult path of awakening and return to a life of easy pleasures. Think about your own life. How often does your mind seduce you away from what you know is good for you? Maybe you've decided to eat healthily, but then your mind shows you vivid images of your favorite junk food. Perhaps you've committed to meditation, but your mind whispers about all the entertaining shows you could be watching instead. The Buddha's response to these temptations reveals something profound about how to handle your own mental cravings. He didn't fight against the desires or try to push them away. He simply observed them with perfect awareness, recognizing them as temporary mental formations that would naturally pass if he didn't feed them with attention. He understood that desire itself isn't the problem. The problem is believing that you must satisfy every desire that arises in your mind. Desires are like clouds passing through the sky of your consciousness. They appear, they move through, and they disappear on their own if you don't grab onto them. When the temptations failed to shake his peace, Mara launched a more vicious attack. Fear. Terrifying visions appeared, threats of death, images of failure, predictions of a meaningless life spent in poverty and obscurity. The message was clear. Abandon this path or face terrible consequences. This is exactly what your own mind does when you try to change deeply ingrained patterns. When you decide to stop letting other people's opinions control your mood, your mind immediately floods you with fears. What if people reject you? What if you end up alone? What if you're making a terrible mistake? The Buddha's response to fear was the same as his response to desire: perfect, non-reactive awareness. He saw that fear, like desire, was just another temporary mental formation. Fear has power over you only when you believe its stories and react to them as if they were real threats. He understood something that can transform your relationship with anxiety forever. Most of your fears are not about what is actually happening right now. They're about imaginary futures that exist only in your mind. By staying present and aware, you can observe these fearful thoughts without being controlled by them. When fear failed to disturb his peace, Mara tried a different approach: doubt. Subtle whispers began. Who do you think you are to claim enlightenment? You're just a confused prince who ran away from responsibility. What makes you think you've found anything real? Maybe you're just deluding yourself. This is perhaps the most dangerous attack, because doubt can undermine even genuine spiritual progress. How many times have you started to feel more peaceful or confident, only to have your mind tell you that it's not real, that you're fooling yourself, that you'll never really change? The Buddha's response to doubt was to touch the earth with his hand, a gesture that said, "The earth is my witness. I have done the work. I have faced the truth. My realization is real." He didn't argue with the doubt or try to convince it. He simply affirmed his direct experience and let the doubt pass through without attachment. Finally, Mara played his last card: pride and superiority. Look what you've accomplished. You're special. You're better than all those ordinary people still trapped in suffering. You should be proud of your achievement and superior to others. This might seem like a positive message, but the Buddha recognized it as the most subtle and dangerous trap of all. The moment you believe you're spiritually superior to others, you've lost the very humility and compassion that made awakening possible in the first place. His response was immediate and clear: "I see you, Mara." In other words, I recognize this as another mental pattern trying to disturb my peace. By naming it clearly, he robbed it of its power to deceive him. This entire encounter teaches us something revolutionary about how to handle the mental storms that try to destroy our inner peace. The Buddha didn't fight against any of these mental attacks. He didn't try to suppress them or argue with them. He simply remained aware and present, allowing each mental formation to arise and pass away naturally. Think about how you usually handle strong desires, fears, doubts, or ego trips. Most people either get completely swept away by these mental states, or they try to fight against them, which often makes them stronger. The Buddha showed a third way: mindful awareness without resistance or attachment. This is the foundation of all Buddhist mental training. Your mind will constantly produce thoughts and emotions designed to disturb your peace. Desires will arise promising happiness if only you chase them. Fears will appear threatening disaster if you don't worry enough. Doubts will whisper that your progress isn't real. Pride will insist you're better than others. None of these mental formations are problems in themselves. They become problems only when you believe them, fight against them, or let them control your actions. The path to freedom is learning to observe them with the same calm awareness the Buddha demonstrated under the Bodhi tree. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't about becoming emotionless or indifferent. The Buddha wasn't a stone statue feeling nothing. He was fully alive and responsive, but he wasn't enslaved by his mental reactions. When you develop this kind of awareness, you can feel angry without being controlled by anger. You can experience desire without being driven by craving. You can notice fear without being paralyzed by anxiety. You can feel sad without being destroyed by depression. This is what Buddhists call liberation, not freedom from all mental and emotional experiences, but freedom from being controlled by them. You become the aware space in which all these experiences arise and pass away, rather than being identified with each passing mental state. The Buddha's victory over Mara wasn't a one-time battle won under a tree. It was the establishment of a way of relating to mind that would serve him for the rest of his life. Every day, Mara would return in various forms as doubt about his teaching, desire for an easier life, fear about the future, or pride in his accomplishments. And every day, the Buddha would meet these challenges with the same aware presence. This is your invitation to do the same. You don't need to achieve perfect enlightenment to benefit from this approach. Starting today, you can begin noticing when desire, fear, doubt, or pride arise in your mind. Instead of fighting them or being swept away by them, you can simply observe them with friendly awareness, knowing they will pass if you don't feed them with reactive attention. But the Buddha's challenges were far from over, because once he began teaching others what he had discovered, he encountered something even more difficult than his own mental patterns: other people's reactions to the truth. And what happened next reveals the secret to maintaining peace when everyone around you seems determined to destroy it. 3 months after the Buddha's enlightenment, word had spread throughout the region about this former prince who claimed to have found the end of all suffering. People came from distant villages, some seeking wisdom, others driven by curiosity, and a few determined to expose what they believed was spiritual fraud. Among these visitors was a young Brahmin priest named Bharadvaja, brilliant in scripture and debate, but burning with anger at what he saw as the Buddha's arrogance. How dare this privileged prince, who had never faced real hardship, claim to understand suffering better than the ancient sages? Bharadvaja had spent years memorizing sacred texts and performing complex rituals. He came from a line of respected priests who had served kings and guided communities for generations. The idea that some dropout prince could surpass centuries of accumulated wisdom with a few weeks under a tree was not just wrong, it was insulting. When Bharadvaja arrived at the grove where the Buddha was teaching, he didn't wait for an invitation to speak. In front of dozens of gathered listeners, he launched into a furious verbal assault that would have devastated most people. "You fraud," He shouted, his face red with rage. "You abandoned your family, your responsibilities, your duty to your people, and now you sit here pretending to be holy. You know nothing about real suffering. You've never been hungry a day in your life before your little forest adventure. You've never worked with your hands or worried about feeding children. How dare you lecture others about the nature of existence?" The other listeners were shocked into silence. Some looked embarrassed for the Buddha, others angry at Bharadvaja's rudeness. A few seemed to enjoy the confrontation, waiting to see how this supposed enlightened being would handle such a vicious attack. But the Buddha's response was something none of them expected. He looked at Bharadvaja with eyes full of compassion and said gently, "My friend, when someone offers you a gift and you don't accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" Bharadvaja was caught off guard by the question, but his scholarly training kicked in. "Well, it belongs to the person who offered it, of course." "Exactly," the Buddha replied with a slight smile. "You have offered me anger, insults, and hatred. I do not accept your gift. So to whom do these things belong?" The young priest stood there speechless as the profound simplicity of this teaching sank in. All his rage, all his carefully crafted insults, all his intellectual superiority, none of it had touched the Buddha's peace because the Buddha had simply chosen not to receive it. This encounter illustrates one of the most life-changing insights in all of Buddhist teaching. Other people can only disturb your peace if you accept their emotional offerings. When someone is angry at you, their anger belongs to them unless you choose to take it on as your own. Think about the last time someone criticized you harshly or treated you with disrespect. What happened in your mind? If you're like most people, you probably accepted their gift of negativity and then carried it around for hours, days, or even weeks. You replayed their words, felt hurt or angry, maybe plotted revenge or sank into self-doubt. But here's what the Buddha understood that can transform every difficult relationship in your life. When people lash out at you, they're usually expressing their own inner pain, not making an accurate statement about you. Bharadvaja's anger wasn't really about the Buddha at all. It was about his own insecurity, his fear that his years of study might be meaningless, his attachment to being seen as spiritually superior. The Buddha could see this clearly because he wasn't caught up in defending his ego. He didn't need Bharadvaja's approval or respect. He didn't need to prove his worth or fight for his reputation. This inner freedom allowed him to respond with compassion instead of reacting with defensiveness. But Bharadvaja wasn't finished. The Buddha's calm response only fueled his rage further. "Don't you dare patronize me with your clever word games," he screamed. "Answer my charges, defend yourself, show some human emotion. Your fake serenity just proves you're a cold, heartless fraud who doesn't care about anything." Again, the Buddha's response was unexpected. Instead of defending himself or showing anger, he asked another gentle question. "Tell me, my friend, when a fire burns in your house, does throwing more fuel on it help put it out?" Bharadvaja paused, his anger flickering with confusion. "No, of course not. You stop feeding it and it dies down." "Yes," the Buddha nodded. "Anger is like fire. When you feed it with more anger, it grows stronger. When you stop feeding it, it naturally dies down. I choose not to add fuel to your inner fire." This teaching reveals something profound about how to handle difficult people in your own life. Most of us have been conditioned to meet anger with anger, criticism with defensiveness, and hostility with hostility. We think this is standing up for ourselves, but actually, it's just adding fuel to the fire of conflict. The Buddha showed a completely different way. When you refuse to match someone's negative energy, when you remain calm in the face of their storm, something remarkable happens. Without fuel from your reactions, their anger burns itself out much more quickly. But here's what's even more important. This isn't about being passive or letting people walk all over you. The Buddha wasn't weak or submissive. He was demonstrating a kind of strength that most people never develop, the strength to remain centered regardless of how others behave. Think about someone in your life who frequently tries to provoke you. Maybe it's a difficult family member, a critical co-worker, or an ex-partner who knows exactly which buttons to push. What would change in that relationship if you stopped accepting their gifts of negativity? As Bharadvaja continued his tirade, other listeners began to see something they had never witnessed before. Here was a person who remained completely peaceful no matter what verbal arrows were shot at him. His calmness wasn't brittle or forced, it was natural and unshakable, like a mountain that remains unmoved whether flowers are placed on it or stones are thrown at it. Gradually, something shifted in Bharadvaja himself. He began to see how his anger was hurting him more than it was hurting the Buddha. The rage that felt so justified and powerful was actually making him miserable while leaving its target completely unaffected. Finally, exhausted from his outburst and moved by the Buddha's consistent compassion, Bharadvaja's anger collapsed into curiosity. How? He asked simply. How do you remain so peaceful when someone attacks you like this? The Buddha's answer became one of the foundational teachings of Buddhism. When you understand that people's reactions to you are really reactions to their own inner state, you stop taking things personally. When you stop taking things personally, you're free to respond with wisdom instead of reacting with emotion. This teaching doesn't mean you become indifferent to others or that you don't care about their opinions. It means you recognize the difference between someone's temporary emotional state and your own permanent inner peace. Their storm doesn't have to become your storm. Bharadvaja spent the next 7 years studying with the Buddha, eventually becoming one of his most dedicated disciples. He later said that the moment he truly understood that his anger belonged to him, not to external circumstances, was the moment his life changed forever. But this encounter raised an even deeper question that would test the Buddha's teaching in ways no one expected. Because if it's possible to remain peaceful with someone who's deliberately trying to hurt you, what happens when you face a challenge that seems to strike at the very core of what you hold most dear? That's exactly what happened when the Buddha encountered his first experience of profound loss after enlightenment. 300 years after the Buddha's passing, in the mountains of ancient China, there lived a Zen master named Linji who had achieved something extraordinary. His reputation for unshakable inner peace had spread across the land, attracting students from every corner of the empire. But with fame came skeptics, and many arrived at his monastery determined to prove that his serenity was nothing more than an act. Linji understood human nature deeply. He knew that true peace couldn't be faked under pressure, so he welcomed these tests. His teaching method was unusual. Instead of giving lectures about enlightenment, He created situations where students could discover the difference between genuine inner freedom and mere intellectual understanding. One autumn morning, a young monk named Puhua arrived at the monastery. Puhua was brilliant, well-educated, and completely convinced that he could expose what he saw as Linji's spiritual pretense. He had studied every Buddhist text, mastered complex meditation techniques, and won numerous debates with other teachers. In his mind, enlightenment was just another intellectual achievement to be attained and displayed. For weeks, Puhua watched Linji carefully, looking for cracks in his composure. He noticed that the master remained equally calm whether praised or criticized, whether facing abundance or scarcity, whether dealing with devoted students or hostile visitors. This consistency only made Puhua more suspicious. Surely no one could be this naturally peaceful. Finally, Puhua devised what he thought was the perfect test. During the evening meditation period, when the entire community sat in perfect silence, he would create maximum disruption and see how Linji really responded under extreme pressure. That night, as 50 monks sat in deep meditation in the candlelit hall, Puhua suddenly leaped to his feet and began screaming at the top of his lungs. "This is all meaningless. You're all wasting your lives sitting here like stones. There is no enlightenment. You're following a fraud who's convinced you that doing nothing is somehow spiritual." The other monks were horrified. Some began crying from the shock. Others looked angry enough to physically remove the disruptor. The sacred atmosphere of the meditation hall had been completely shattered. Many years of training had taught them to value silence and respect above almost everything else. But Master Linji's response was something none of them, including Puhua, had anticipated. He continued sitting in perfect stillness, but now a gentle smile played at the corners of his mouth. When Puhua finally stopped shouting, Linji opened his eyes slowly and said with genuine warmth, "Thank you for that wonderful demonstration. You have just shown everyone the difference between a mind that is enslaved by its emotions and a mind that is free." Puhua was speechless. He had thrown everything he had at this master: public humiliation, destruction of sacred space, accusations of fraud, and it had affected Linji less than a gentle breeze affects a mountain. But Linji wasn't finished teaching. He turned to address all the students present. "Look carefully at what just happened here. Our friend Puhua believes he was attacking me, but actually he was demonstrating his own inner turmoil. His anger, his need to prove himself, his compulsion to disturb others' peace, these things live inside him, not outside him." This response illustrates one of the most profound insights in Zen Buddhism. When you achieve true inner stability, external circumstances lose their power to control your emotional state. Linji had developed what Zen teachers call the unshakable mind, not because he was cold or unfeeling, but because he understood something most people never learn. Think about your own reactions to difficult people. When someone criticizes your work, insults your appearance, or questions your decisions, what happens inside you? If you're like most people, their words immediately create emotional turbulence that can last for hours or days. You might replay the interaction obsessively, feel hurt or angry, or lose sleep thinking about what you should have said. But here's what Linji understood that can transform every challenging relationship in your life. Other people's emotional states are information about their inner world, not accurate statements about you. When Puhua screamed insults, he was expressing his own frustration, insecurity, and confusion. It had nothing to do with Linji's actual character or worth. This insight leads to a revolutionary way of relating to criticism and conflict. Instead of taking attacks personally, you can observe them with curiosity and compassion. What inner pain is driving this person's need to lash out? What fears or insecurities are they projecting onto you? Puhua, still reeling from Linji's response, demanded an explanation. How can you just sit there when someone attacks everything you stand for? Don't you have any pride, any self-respect, any human emotions at all? Linji's answer became one of the foundational teachings of Zen. I have great respect for myself, which is exactly why I don't let your inner turmoil become my inner turmoil. I care deeply about all beings, which is why I refuse to add more suffering to an already painful world by reacting with anger to your anger. This response reveals something crucial about what it means to have genuine self-respect. Most people think self-respect means defending yourself aggressively when attacked. But Linji demonstrated that true self-respect means maintaining your inner peace regardless of how others behave. When you react emotionally to every provocation, you're essentially saying that other people have more control over your inner state than you do. You're giving away your power to anyone who knows which buttons to push. This isn't strength, it's a form of emotional slavery. The unshakable mind that Linji demonstrated isn't about suppressing emotions or becoming indifferent to others. It's about developing such a strong sense of inner stability that external events cannot knock you off balance. You can still feel compassion, love, and appropriate responses to situations, but you're not at the mercy of every emotional wind that blows. As the weeks passed, Puhua found himself deeply affected by what he had witnessed. He had expected to expose a fraud, but instead he had encountered something he didn't know was possible. A human being who was genuinely free from the emotional reactivity that had controlled his own life for decades. Gradually, Puhua's hostility transformed into curiosity, then respect, and finally deep gratitude. He began to understand that Linji's peace wasn't a performance or a spiritual achievement to be proud of. It was simply the natural result of seeing clearly how the mind works. Under Linji's guidance, Puhua learned to observe his own mental patterns without being controlled by them. He discovered that thoughts and emotions are like weather patterns in the sky of consciousness. They arise, they change, and they pass away, but they don't have to determine your actions or define your sense of self. This training in what Buddhists call non-attachment doesn't mean you stop caring about people or outcomes. It means you stop being enslaved by the need for things to be a certain way. You can love deeply without being possessive, work hard without being obsessed with results, and face criticism without being crushed by it. Years later, Puhua became a respected teacher himself, known for his gentle wisdom and unshakable composure. He would often tell students about the night he tried to break Master Linji's peace and how that failure became the greatest gift of his life. But the story of unshakable peace faces its ultimate test when it encounters not just difficult people, but devastating loss. Because while it's one thing to remain calm when someone insults you, it's quite another to maintain equanimity when life takes away something you love more than life itself. And that's exactly the challenge that would reveal the deepest secrets of Buddhist wisdom about grief, impermanence, and the love that transcends attachment. In the mountains of medieval Japan lived a Zen master named Ikkyu, renowned throughout the land for his wisdom, poetry, and profound understanding of the Buddha's teachings. Unlike many monks who lived in isolation, Ikkyu was deeply connected to the world around him. He loved beauty, art, and especially the people who came to him seeking guidance. Among all his students, there was one who held a special place in his heart, a young monk named Jiso. Ikkyu had found Jiso as an orphaned child, begging in the streets of Kyoto. Something in the boy's eyes spoke of both great suffering and great potential, so Ikkyu brought him to the monastery and raised him as both student and spiritual son. For 20 years, Jiso lived and studied with Ikkyu. He was brilliant, compassionate, and devoted not just to Buddhist practice, but to serving others. Under Ikkyu's guidance, he had developed into a teacher himself, helping to run the monastery and counseling visitors who came seeking wisdom. The bond between them was unlike typical teacher-student relationships. They would spend hours walking in the temple gardens, discussing philosophy, composing poetry together, and sharing the kind of deep friendship that emerges when two souls recognize each other completely. Jiso had become not just Ikkyu's finest student, but the heir to his spiritual lineage and the son he never had. One winter morning, Jiso didn't appear for the dawn meditation. This was highly unusual. In 20 years, he had never missed a single morning practice. When Ikkyu went to check on him, he found his beloved student had died peacefully in his sleep, a serene expression on his face that suggested he had simply let go of life as naturally as a leaf falls from a tree. The news spread through the monastery like wildfire. The other monks were devastated. Jiso had been loved by everyone who knew him, but all eyes turned to Master Ikkyu. How would this great teacher of non-attachment handle the loss of the person he loved most in the world? The students expected to see a demonstration of perfect Buddhist equanimity. They thought Ikkyu would deliver a wise teaching about impermanence, perhaps quote a sutra about the illusory nature of life and death, and show them how an enlightened being transcends grief through spiritual understanding. Instead, they witnessed something that initially shocked them. Master Ikkyu knelt beside Jiso's body and began to weep. Not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. He cried for hours, holding his student's hand, speaking to him as if he were still alive, expressing his love and his profound sense of loss. Some of the younger monks were confused and even scandalized. One of them, feeling he needed to remind the master of proper Buddhist deportment, approached hesitantly and said, "Master, why do you weep so? Have you not taught us that all things are impermanent? Have you not said that attachment is the root of suffering? Should not an enlightened being like yourself be beyond such emotional displays?" Ikkyu looked up with tears streaming down his face and replied in a voice filled with both grief and profound wisdom. "Yes, all things are impermanent. That is exactly why I weep. Jiso's life was brief and precious precisely because it could not last forever. This grief I feel is not suffering, it is love expressing itself in the face of impermanence." This response reveals one of the most misunderstood aspects of Buddhist teaching about attachment and suffering. Many people think that spiritual development means becoming emotionless, that enlightenment requires cutting yourself off from deep feelings about the people and things you care about. But Ikkyu was demonstrating something far more profound. He was showing the difference between attachment and love, between clinging and caring, between the suffering that comes from resistance to reality and the natural emotional responses that are part of being fully human. Think about your own relationship with loss and grief. When someone you love dies, when a relationship ends, or when you face any significant loss, what do you tell yourself you should feel? Many people try to suppress their grief, thinking that sadness is a sign of weakness or spiritual failure. But Ikkyu understood that grief is love with nowhere to go. When you love someone deeply and they're no longer in your life, the love doesn't just disappear, it transforms into grief. This isn't a problem to be solved or a weakness to be overcome. It's a natural expression of the human heart's capacity to care deeply. The key insight is the difference between grieving and suffering. Ikkyu was grieving, feeling the natural sadness that comes when love meets impermanence. But he wasn't suffering in the Buddhist sense, because he wasn't fighting against reality. He wasn't demanding that Jiso should still be alive, or torturing himself with regrets about things left unsaid, or creating stories about how unfair life is. He was simply allowing himself to feel the full impact of loss, while accepting that this too was part of life's natural flow. His tears were an expression of gratitude for having known such love, not a rebellion against the way things are. As days passed, the monks watched Ikkyu navigate his grief with a grace they had never seen before. He continued to teach, to care for the monastery, and to help others with their problems. But he also allowed himself to feel sad when sadness arose, to miss Jiso when memories surfaced, and to honor his love through the very act of grieving. One evening, about a month after Jiso's death, a visitor asked Ikkyu how Buddhist practice had helped him cope with such a devastating loss. His answer became one of the most profound teachings on grief ever recorded. Buddhist practice didn't help me avoid grief, it helped me grieve completely. When you truly understand impermanence, you don't love less to protect yourself from loss. You love more fully because you know that every moment together is precious and unrepeatable. The pain of losing Jiso is proportional to the joy of having known him. I would not trade either one. This teaching offers a radically different approach to handling loss in your own life. Instead of trying to protect yourself from grief by loving less or remaining detached, you can love fully while accepting that loss is inevitable. Instead of fighting against sadness when it arises, you can welcome it as an expression of your capacity to care deeply. The difference between healthy grief and destructive suffering lies not in the intensity of your feelings, but in your relationship to those feelings. Healthy grief flows through you and eventually transforms into gratitude and peace. Destructive suffering gets stuck because you're fighting against what you feel or what has happened. Ikkyu lived for many more years after Jiso's death, and he often spoke of how that loss had deepened rather than diminished his spiritual understanding. He learned that true non-attachment isn't about caring less. It's about loving fully while holding everything lightly, knowing that all of life's gifts are temporary and precious precisely because they cannot last forever. His example showed that enlightenment doesn't make you less human, it makes you more human. It allows you to feel everything more deeply while being enslaved by nothing. You can experience profound grief without being destroyed by it, intense joy without clinging to it, and deep love without the fear that makes love possessive. But even the wisdom gained from navigating personal loss faces its ultimate test when an entire community confronts disaster. Because individual peace, no matter how profound, means little if it can't extend to helping others in their darkest hours. And that's exactly what happened when Ikkyu's monastery faced a crisis that would either prove or shatter everything he had learned about finding calm in the midst of chaos. 5 years after Jiso's death, Master Ikkyu's monastery faced its greatest trial. A terrible drought had gripped the region for 18 months, followed by devastating floods that washed away crops and contaminated water sources. The local villages, which had always supported the monastery with food donations, were now struggling to feed their own families. Winter was approaching, and the monastery's food stores were nearly empty. 43 monks depended on Ikkyu's leadership, and many of them were beginning to panic. Some suggested abandoning the monastery and scattering to find individual shelter. Others proposed sending desperate letters to distant temples, begging for aid. A few even whispered that perhaps they should break their vows and return to lay life to survive. The crisis deepened when a government official arrived with devastating news. The local daimyo, facing his own economic pressures, was confiscating temple lands throughout the province to sell to merchants. Ikkyu's monastery had 1 month to pay an enormous tax or lose everything they had built over generations. As word of these disasters spread through the monastery, fear began to consume the community. During meditation periods, monks fidgeted anxiously instead of finding peace. Meals became tense affairs where conversations focused obsessively on worst-case scenarios. Sleep was disturbed by worries about the future. The very place that had been a sanctuary of calm was now filled with the kind of anxiety and desperation that the Buddha's teachings were meant to transform. Young monk Issei, who had joined the community only 2 years earlier, approached Master Ikkyu with tears in his eyes. "Master, I've lost all my peace. I can't meditate, I can't sleep, I can't even chant without my mind racing with fears about what will happen to us. How can we practice Buddhism when we are facing disaster? How can we find inner calm when external circumstances are so terrifying?" Ikkyu listened to Issei's distress with the same compassionate attention he had always given to students' questions, but his response surprised everyone who heard it. Instead of offering comforting platitudes or complex philosophical explanations, he said simply, "This crisis is not interrupting our practice. This crisis is our practice." Over the following days, Ikkyu demonstrated what he meant through his actions rather than his words. While other leaders might have spent their time frantically planning, seeking loans, or negotiating with officials, Ikkyu continued his normal routine with extraordinary presence and calm. Each morning, he still rose before dawn for meditation, sitting in perfect stillness even as hungry monks shifted restlessly around him. He still tended the temple gardens, watering plants and pulling weeds, as if the monastery's future was completely secure. He still received visitors with full attention, listening to their problems and offering guidance as though he had no worries of his own. But this wasn't denial or escapism. Ikkyu was also taking practical action. He wrote letters seeking help, met with local officials, and worked with the senior monks to ration their remaining food. The difference was that he approached these crisis management tasks with the same serene focus he brought to meditation. When anxious monks came to him with their fears, instead of dismissing their concerns or offering false reassurance, he would ask them questions that shifted their perspective. What are you afraid will happen? How will worrying about that possibility change the outcome? What can you actually control in this situation? What would you do right now if you knew everything would work out perfectly? Through these conversations, the monks began to understand something profound about the relationship between external circumstances and inner peace. They realized that their suffering wasn't actually being caused by the drought, the floods, or even the threat of losing their home. Their suffering was being caused by their mental resistance to these realities. The drought was just weather. The government's actions were just politics. The food shortage was just a logistical challenge. None of these situations were inherently painful. They were simply circumstances requiring response. The pain came from their mind's insistence that these things shouldn't be happening, that life should be different, that they deserved security and predictability. Ikkyu helped them see that this mental resistance was not only causing unnecessary suffering, but actually making them less effective at handling the crisis. When your mind is consumed with fear and resistance, you can't think clearly, make good decisions, or take skillful action. Peace of mind isn't a luxury you can only afford when life is easy. It's a practical necessity that becomes most valuable when life is difficult. As the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen in the monastery. Instead of falling apart under pressure, the community grew stronger. Monks who had been practicing individual spirituality for years suddenly discovered the power of collective resilience. They organized efficient systems for rationing food, with everyone accepting smaller portions without complaint. They found creative ways to generate income, selling calligraphy and offering meditation instruction to local communities. They reached out to help neighboring villages, sharing their limited resources with families who had even less. Most importantly, they learned to support each other's practice during difficult times. When one monk felt overwhelmed by anxiety, others would sit with him in meditation. When someone's faith wavered, the community would remind him of the teachings through their own example of calm perseverance. The crisis that could have destroyed their spiritual practice actually deepened it. They discovered that Buddhism isn't just about finding peace in quiet temple halls. It's about maintaining clarity and compassion in the midst of life's inevitable storms. 3 weeks before the tax deadline, when the situation seemed most hopeless, an unexpected solution appeared. A wealthy merchant from a distant province, whose son had been helped by the monastery years earlier, arrived with enough gold to pay the tax and replenish their food stores. But by then, the monks had already learned something more valuable than financial security. They had discovered that true spiritual practice doesn't depend on perfect conditions. In fact, adversity often reveals depths of wisdom and strength that comfort never could. The crisis had stripped away all their external securities and forced them to rely entirely on their inner resources, and those resources had proven more than adequate. Ikkyu reflected on this experience in one of his most famous poems. The pine tree teaches silence, the rock teaches stillness, but only the storm teaches you whether your roots go deep enough. The monastery's survival wasn't really about the merchant's timely arrival. It was about 43 people learning to face uncertainty with courage, scarcity with generosity, and fear with faith. They had discovered that external security is always temporary and often illusory, but inner security, the peace that comes from trusting your ability to respond wisely to whatever arises, can never be taken away. This experience taught them something that would transform how they approached every future challenge. The goal isn't to eliminate problems from your life, but to develop the inner strength to meet any problem with wisdom and grace. When you have that strength, you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You're free to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be driven by fear. But developing this inner strength requires more than just understanding these principles intellectually. It requires daily practice, specific techniques, and the kind of mental training that transforms occasional insights into permanent ways of being. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next, the ancient meditation practice that makes unshakable peace not just a beautiful ideal, but a living reality. In ancient India, shortly after the Buddha's Enlightenment, there lived a merchant named Anathapindika who had heard extraordinary rumors about this awakened teacher. Wealthy beyond measure, but tormented by anxiety that kept him awake every night, Anathapindika traveled hundreds of miles to meet the Buddha, hoping to find relief from the mental suffering that all his riches couldn't cure. When he finally encountered the Buddha sitting peacefully beneath a mango tree, Anathapindika poured out his troubles. Despite having everything money could buy, his mind was constantly racing with worries about his business, his family's safety, his health, and 1,000 imaginary disasters that might befall him. He had consulted physicians, philosophers, and spiritual teachers, but nothing had brought him lasting peace. The Buddha listened with complete attention, then said something that would change not just Anathapindika's life, but the lives of millions who would practice this teaching over the centuries. The mind is like a wild elephant, powerful but untrained. Left to its own devices, it will destroy everything in its path. But when trained with patience and skill, that same mind becomes your greatest ally. Instead of giving a complex lecture about philosophy or psychology, the Buddha offered Anathapindika something remarkably simple, a breathing practice that anyone could learn in minutes, but would take a lifetime to master fully. Sit comfortably, the Buddha instructed, and simply observe your breath. Don't try to control it or change it. Just watch the natural rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. When your mind wanders, and it will wander constantly at first, gently bring your attention back to the breath. That's the entire practice. Anathapindika was skeptical. How could something so simple address the complex problems that plagued his mind? But the Buddha explained something that modern neuroscience would later confirm. The quality of your attention determines the quality of your life experience, and attention can be trained like any other skill. Right now, the Buddha said, Your attention is scattered in all directions. Part of your mind is reliving yesterday's business meeting. Part is worrying about tomorrow's negotiations. Part is planning next week's travel. And part is creating imaginary problems that may never happen. No wonder you feel anxious and exhausted. He pointed to a nearby stream flowing between the rocks. See how the water becomes clear when it stops rushing and finds a quiet pool. Your mind works the same way. When you train your attention to rest on one simple object, the breath, the mental turbulence begins to settle and natural clarity emerges. The Buddha taught Anathapindika a specific technique that has been passed down through Zen lineages for over 2 millennia. It's called Anapanasati, which means mindfulness of breathing, and it works by using the breath as an anchor for awareness. Here's how the practice works, exactly as the Buddha taught it. Find a comfortable sitting position where your spine is naturally upright but not rigid. You can sit on a cushion, a chair, or even against a wall for support. The key is to be alert but relaxed, like a cat watching a mouse hole, attentive but not tense. Close your eyes or soften your gaze toward the ground. Take 3 natural breaths to settle into your body, then begin simply noticing the sensation of breathing. You're not trying to breathe in any special way, just observe whatever breath is naturally happening. Feel the cool air entering your nostrils on the inhalation. Notice the slight pause between in-breath and out-breath. Feel the warm air flowing out on the exhalation. Notice the pause between out-breath and in-breaths. This complete cycle, in, pause, out, pause, becomes your object of meditation. The Buddha was very specific about what to do when your mind wanders, because this is where most people get frustrated and give up. He said, when you notice your attention has drifted to thoughts, memories, plans, or anything else, simply acknowledge that wandering has happened, then gently guide your attention back to the breath. Don't fight with your thoughts or judge yourself for getting distracted. Treat your wandering mind the way you would treat a beloved but easily distracted child, with patience and kindness. This gentle returning of attention to the breath is not a failure in meditation, it is the meditation. Each time you notice your mind has wandered and bring it back, you're strengthening your capacity for awareness and developing what Buddhists call mindfulness. As Anathapindika began practicing this technique under the Buddha's guidance, he experienced something he had never felt before. Within just a few minutes of focused breathing, the constant chatter in his mind began to quiet. The anxiety that had tormented him for years started to dissolve, replaced by a sense of calm presence he didn't know was possible. But the Buddha warned him not to expect dramatic results immediately. This practice is like tending a garden, he explained. Plant seeds of mindfulness each day through regular meditation, water them with consistency and patience, and over time you will harvest fruits of peace that no external circumstance can destroy. Modern science has validated everything the Buddha taught about this practice. Researchers have found that regular meditation literally rewires the brain, strengthening areas associated with attention, emotional regulation, and compassion, while reducing activity in regions linked to anxiety, depression, and reactivity. Just 10 minutes of daily breathing meditation has been shown to reduce stress hormones, lower blood pressure, improve sleep quality, boost immune function, and increase overall life satisfaction. But these physical benefits are just the beginning of what this practice can offer. The deeper gift of breath meditation is that it trains you to be present with whatever is happening in your life without being overwhelmed by it. When you can rest your attention calmly on something as simple as breathing, you develop the capacity to remain centered during much more challenging experiences. Think about the last time you felt really anxious or upset. What was happening in your mind? Probably racing thoughts, catastrophic imaginations, and mental stories about how terrible everything was or might become. Breath meditation trains you to step out of that mental whirlwind and find a place of stillness within yourself. The Buddha taught Anathapindika to practice for just 10 minutes each morning and evening, but the effects extended throughout his entire day. When business problems arose, instead of immediately falling into anxiety, he would take a few conscious breaths and approach the situation with clarity. When people criticized him, he could feel the initial sting without being consumed by defensive reactions. After 6 months of consistent practice, Anathapindika reported that his chronic insomnia had disappeared, his relationships had improved dramatically, and his business decisions had become more skillful because they were made from calm wisdom rather than anxious reactivity. But perhaps most importantly, he had discovered something that no amount of wealth could buy: the ability to find peace within himself regardless of what was happening around him. He learned that happiness doesn't come from having perfect circumstances, but from developing the inner capacity to meet any circumstances with presence and equanimity. The breathing meditation that transformed Anathapindika's life is available to you right now. You don't need special equipment, years of training, or perfect conditions. You just need the willingness to sit quietly and pay attention to something you're already doing every moment of every day: breathing. But this practice, powerful as it is for individual peace, reveals its greatest potential when it extends beyond personal meditation into the realm of relationships. Because the mindfulness you develop sitting quietly with your breath becomes the foundation for bringing wisdom and compassion into every interaction with others. And that's where we discover how ancient Buddhist wisdom can transform the most challenging aspect of human life. Learning to love without attachment, to care without clinging, and to find peace even in the midst of relationship conflicts. In ancient China, during the Tang dynasty, there lived 2 Zen practitioners named Beijiang and Huangbo who demonstrated something extraordinary: a love so pure and free that it transformed everyone who witnessed it. They were not romantic partners, but spiritual companions whose relationship became a teaching in itself about what the Buddha called loving without clinging. Beijiang was an established Zen master, renowned for his wisdom and compassion. Huangbo was his student, but their connection transcended typical teacher-student dynamics. They shared a bond of profound mutual respect, deep affection, and complete freedom from the possessiveness that usually accompanies close relationships. What made their relationship remarkable wasn't the depth of their caring. It was the complete absence of attachment to outcomes, expectations, or the need to control each other. They loved fully while holding lightly, cared deeply without clinging, and supported each other's growth even when it meant growing apart. This might sound contradictory to everything you've learned about love. Most people believe that loving someone means wanting to possess them, control them, or at least ensure they'll never leave. We think jealousy proves love, that worry shows care, and that attachment demonstrates commitment. But Buddhist wisdom reveals a different kind of love, one that's actually stronger and more fulfilling, because it's free from the fear, anxiety, and suffering that contaminate most relationships. One autumn day, a wealthy merchant came to study with Beijing, bringing his teenage son who was struggling with intense romantic obsession. The young man had fallen desperately in love with a girl from his village and was making himself miserable with jealousy, possessiveness, and constant fear that she might choose someone else. "Master," the father pleaded, "please teach my son about love. He's destroying himself and everyone around him with his attachment to this girl." Beijing listened to the young man's story with compassion, then asked him to observe how he and Huangbo interacted over the coming days. "Watch carefully," he said, "and see if you can identify what makes our love different from your attachment." Over the following week, the young man witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about relationships. He saw Beijing and Huangbo spend hours together in deep conversation, clearly delighting in each other's company, yet neither seemed to cling to the other's presence when duty called them apart. When Huangbo had to travel to another monastery for several months, Beijing bid him farewell with genuine joy for his friend's opportunities, without a trace of sadness or possessiveness. When Huangbo received an offer to establish his own teaching center in a distant province, Beijing encouraged him enthusiastically, despite knowing it might mean they'd rarely see each other. Most puzzling of all, when other students sometimes seemed to prefer Huangbo's teaching style to Beijing's, the master showed no jealousy or competition, only delight in his students' growing wisdom and influence. "How is this possible?" the young man asked. "If you truly love someone, shouldn't you want to keep them close? Shouldn't you feel hurt when they choose others over you? How can you be happy about Huangbo leaving when you clearly care about him so much?" Beijing's response became one of the most profound teachings on love in Buddhist literature. "I love Huangbo completely, which is exactly why I want him to be free. True love desires the beloved's highest happiness and fullest expression, even if that means letting them go." He explained that what most people call love is actually a mixture of genuine affection and selfish attachment. The genuine affection wants the other person to flourish and be happy. The selfish attachment wants to possess, control, and keep the other person for yourself. When you truly love someone, Beijing continued, you love them for who they are, not for what they give you. You want them to grow, even if that growth takes them beyond your understanding. You want them to follow their highest calling, even if it leads them away from you. Think about your own relationships, romantic partnerships, friendships, family connections. How much of what you call love is actually attachment? How often do you feel anxious when loved ones don't respond to your messages quickly enough? How frequently do you feel hurt when they choose to spend time with others instead of you? These painful feelings aren't signs of deep love, they're symptoms of attachment. They arise when you're relating to others as sources of your security, validation, or happiness, rather than as unique beings deserving freedom and respect. The young merchant's son was bewildered. But if I don't hold on to my beloved, won't I lose her? If I don't worry about our relationship, won't it fall apart? If I don't feel jealous, doesn't that mean I don't really care? Huangbo, who had been listening quietly, offered his own insight. Attachment doesn't preserve love, it destroys it. When you cling to someone out of fear, you transform the relationship from a source of joy into a source of anxiety. Your beloved stops being a person to cherish and becomes an object to possess. He explained that attachment creates a prison for both people in a relationship. The attached person lives in constant fear of loss, while the object of attachment feels suffocated by someone else's neediness and control. But love without attachment, Huangbo continued, creates freedom for both people to be authentic, to grow, and to choose the relationship fresh each day rather than feeling trapped by obligation or fear. This teaching doesn't mean you become indifferent to the people you love. Beizhang and Huangbo clearly cared deeply about each other's well-being and happiness. The difference is that their caring was free from the desperate need to control outcomes or possess each other. When you love without attachment, you can feel sad when someone leaves without being destroyed by their departure. You can desire someone's company without making them responsible for your happiness. You can commit to a relationship without clinging to it out of fear. Over the following months, as the young man learned to practice this approach with his romantic interest, something remarkable happened. When he stopped being possessive and controlling, she was naturally drawn to spend more time with him. When he stopped demanding constant reassurance of her affection, she felt free to express it genuinely. Most importantly, he discovered that his happiness was no longer dependent on her responses to him. He could feel joy in her presence and contentment in her absence. He could love her fully while remaining complete within himself. This is the paradox of non-attached love. When you stop clinging to someone, you actually become closer to them. When you stop trying to control the relationship, it naturally flourishes. When you stop making your happiness dependent on another person, you become someone others genuinely want to be around. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering, but many people misunderstand this to mean you should stop caring about others. The truth is exactly the opposite. Non-attachment allows you to care more purely, love more freely, and connect more authentically. Years later, when Huangbo did establish his own monastery in a distant province, he and Beizhang maintained their deep friendship through occasional letters filled with mutual support and encouragement. Their love had transcended physical proximity, possessiveness, and the normal limitations of human relationships. The young merchant's son, now a mature practitioner himself, would often tell visitors, "I used to think love meant never letting go. Now I understand that true love is knowing when to hold on and when to release, when to come closer and when to step back, when to speak and when to remain silent, all in service of what's truly best for the beloved." But even this profound understanding of love faces its ultimate test when confronted with the reality that all relationships, no matter how beautiful, must eventually end. Because the deepest teaching of Buddhism isn't just about loving without attachment. It's about finding peace with the impermanence that touches every aspect of life. And that final lesson comes through learning to live fully while accepting that everything we love will one day pass away. Master Yunmen was 93 years old when he gathered his students for what he sensed would be his final teaching. For over 70 years, he had guided seekers on the path to enlightenment, helping thousands discover the unshakable peace that exists within every human heart. Now, as his body grew weak, but his mind remained crystal clear, he wanted to share the most essential wisdom he had learned about living fully while accepting life's impermanence. Unlike his usual dynamic teaching style, Yunmen spoke slowly and quietly, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent in deep practice. The meditation hall was packed with students who had traveled from across the empire to hear what they knew might be their master's last discourse. "My dear friends," he began, his voice still strong despite his frail appearance, "you have come seeking the secret to eternal peace, but I must tell you something that may surprise you. The secret is not to escape impermanence, but to embrace it so completely that it becomes your greatest teacher." He paused, looking into the faces of his students with eyes that sparkled with both wisdom and mischief. "For 70 years, I have been asked the same question in countless different forms. How can I find lasting happiness in a world where everything changes? How can I feel secure when nothing is permanent? How can I love deeply when loss is inevitable?" The master smiled gently. "These are the wrong questions, born from the illusion that permanent security is possible or even desirable. Let me tell you the story of how I learned to ask better questions." Yunmen shared that in his early years of practice, he had been tormented by the same fears that plague most people. He desperately wanted to find a state of enlightenment that would protect him from loss, change, and suffering forever. He meditated for hours trying to reach some permanent state of bliss. He studied texts obsessively, hoping to find philosophical arguments that would make impermanence less real. "I was like a man trying to build a house on a river," he said, constantly frustrated that my foundation kept shifting with the current. "It took me many years to understand that the river itself was the perfect foundation, not despite its movement, but because of it." His breakthrough came during a particularly difficult period when he lost 3 people he loved within a single year: his teacher, his closest friend, and his younger brother. Instead of being crushed by these losses, something in him finally surrendered to the truth he had been fighting against his entire life. In that moment of complete acceptance, Yunmen recalled, "I discovered that impermanence wasn't the enemy of peace, it was peace itself. When you stop fighting against the flowing nature of existence and learn to flow with it, you find a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on circumstances remaining the same." He explained that most people spend their lives in a futile battle against change. They try to preserve youth, cling to relationships, accumulate possessions for security, and create elaborate plans to control an inherently uncontrollable future. This resistance to life's natural flow is what creates suffering, not the changes themselves. Imagine a tree that tried to prevent its leaves from falling in autumn, the master said. It would exhaust itself fighting against nature's wisdom. But the tree that releases its leaves freely not only survives winter, it prepares itself for the abundant growth of spring. Yunmen taught that accepting impermanence doesn't mean becoming passive or stop caring about life. Instead, it means engaging fully with whatever is present while holding everything lightly. You can love deeply while knowing that all relationships change. You can work hard while knowing that all achievements are temporary. You can care for your health while knowing that aging and death are inevitable. This understanding transforms everything, he continued. When you know that this conversation we're having right now will never happen again in exactly this way, you listen more carefully. When you realize that this day is unique and unrepeatable, you pay attention more fully. When you accept that your time with loved ones is limited, you waste less of it on petty arguments and more of it on genuine connection. A young monk raised his hand and asked, "Master, if everything is impermanent, what's the point of spiritual practice? Why work so hard to develop wisdom and compassion if they too will pass away?" Yunmen's eyes lit up with delight at the question. "Excellent, you're beginning to understand. The point of spiritual practice isn't to achieve something permanent that you can possess forever. The point is to live each moment so fully awake that impermanence becomes a gift rather than a curse." He explained that when you truly accept the temporary nature of all experiences, you stop postponing your happiness until conditions are perfect. You stop waiting for some future moment when you'll finally feel secure, successful, or loved enough. You discover that peace and joy are available right now, not despite the uncertainty of life, but within it. Every breath you take is impermanent, Yunmen observed. Each one comes and goes, never to return. Yet this very impermanence is what makes breathing possible. If your first breath had been permanent, you would have died long ago. The flowing nature of breath sustains life itself. This became his core teaching about what he called the wisdom of impermanence. When you align yourself with life's natural rhythm of arising and passing away, you stop exhausting yourself in futile battles against reality. You learn to appreciate beauty more deeply because you know it won't last forever. You treat others with more kindness because you understand that your time together is precious and limited. The enlightenment you seek, Yunmen told his students, is not a permanent state you achieve and then possess. It's a way of being present that must be chosen fresh in each moment. It's like walking, you never arrive at walking, you just keep taking steps. As the teaching session drew to a close, students began asking practical questions about how to apply this wisdom in daily life. Yunmen offered simple but profound guidance. When you wake up each morning, remember that this day has never existed before and will never come again. Let that awareness guide you to engage with whatever arises, joy or sorrow, success or failure, love or loss, with complete presence rather than resistance. When you interact with others, remember that every conversation is temporary and precious. Listen as if this might be the last time you speak with this person. Speak as if your words might be the only kindness they receive today. When you face difficulties, remember that like all things, they are temporary visitors in your life. They come bearing gifts of strength and wisdom if you meet them with courage rather than resistance. As the evening drew to a close, Master Yunmen looked around at his students one final time. "The greatest teaching I can give you is this: stop waiting for your life to become permanent before you start living it fully. Stop postponing your peace until you feel secure. Stop withholding your love until you're guaranteed it won't be lost. Everything you are afraid of losing, your youth, your health, your relationships, even your life itself, is already in the process of changing. This is not a tragedy to be feared, but a truth to be embraced. When you make peace with impermanence, you make peace with life itself." 3 days later, Master Yunmen died peacefully in his sleep, his face serene and peaceful. His students found that he had prepared his own funeral arrangements and left detailed instructions for continuing their practice. Even in death, he demonstrated the grace that comes from accepting life's natural rhythms without resistance. His final written words, found on his meditation cushion, simply said, "The river keeps flowing. Be the river." These stories from Buddhist masters across the centuries all point to the same profound truth. The peace you're searching for isn't something you achieve in the future, it's something you choose in this moment. The unshakable calm that seems so elusive isn't dependent on perfect circumstances. It emerges when you stop fighting against the circumstances you have. Right now, as you listen to these words, you have everything you need to begin transforming your relationship with stress, anxiety, and suffering. You don't need years of meditation retreat or perfect understanding of Buddhist philosophy. You just need the willingness to start where you are, with whatever challenges you're facing. Take 3 conscious breaths right now. Feel your body in this moment. Notice that despite whatever difficulties you're dealing with, in this instant, you are okay. This simple awareness, that peace exists within you regardless of external circumstances, is the beginning of everything we've explored together. The masters whose stories you've heard weren't superhuman. They were people like you who decided to stop letting external circumstances control their inner state. They discovered that happiness isn't something life gives you when conditions are right. It's something you choose when you understand how your mind works. Your journey toward unshakable peace begins with a single step: the decision to stop waiting for your life to become peaceful and start bringing peace to your life. Start today. Start with 1 conscious breath, 1 moment of accepting what is, 1 instance of responding with wisdom instead of reacting with emotion. The wisdom of the Buddha, tested by countless practitioners over 2,500 years, is now yours to apply. The only question remaining is, will you use it? Your transformation starts now. Welcome to the path of awakening.